Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am very happy to be talking with Freddie deBoer. Freddie is a writer and academic. He's got a master's in writing and rhetoric from the University of Rhode Island and a PhD in English from Perdue University. He is the author of the book, The Cult of Smart: How Our Broken Education System Perpetrates Social Injustice. And that is most of what we talk about today. We talk about a variety of things, actually, but that's where much of our emphasis is on. Freddie has a wonderful Substack, which is freddiedeboer.substack.com, and that's where he does a lot of writing, and you can read a lot of his writing outside of the book there. In the conversation, we start out by talking about some political theory. So Freddie is a self-proclaimed Marxist, and he uses that term, and he, in the conversation, explains what he means by that. So the first half of the conversation, we talk about what is Marxism, how Marxism works today, and how it connects or doesn't with communism and socialism. So we spend probably about a good quarter or so of the conversation about that, which was really interesting. I've had a lot of I've read a lot of Freddie's stuff, and he doesn't write as much about that. Sometimes he does, and so it was really cool to get him just to get the full download of where his mind is on that stuff, how he uses it, how he thinks about it. Most of the time, people know him about writing stuff about culture or education, and so it was really, really nice to hear him talk about the Marxism piece that he also is interested in. We talk about what the cult of smart is, basically how there's this very much overemphasis on education in the United States and in other places, and how there's less of an emphasis on other things, other ways of learning. We talk about manufacturing and technical jobs and how those are very important and should have a lot of value. We talk about various education systems around the world and how they compare to the United States, for better or for worse. We talk about the idea of capacity, one's capacity and their abilities for achievement. We talk about the role of genetics and the hereditarian left. We talk about equality and equity. We talk about the lack of quality education and why just giving quality education might not be enough of an answer to fix some of the things in the education system. We talk about No Child Left Behind, Common Core, charter schools, many of the more recent, I'd say past 20 years or so, advancements to try and reform education, at least in the United States. And then we end the conversation by talking about solutions for our education system. Freddie is somebody that's got so many interesting ideas, and so I was so excited to talk to him about those ideas. And I think one of the things I've kind of walked away with from the conversation was he's terribly consistent. He's definitely consistent with the educational piece of things, but he's also consistent with his political beliefs, and everything else kind of sort of makes sense. So it all is a kind of nice, streamlined way of kind of understanding him. Super fascinating. I really, really enjoy talking to him. He's a wonderful person. He's got some fascinating ideas. Some of them that pushed me, and I was like, that I never thought of that way. That's really interesting. We should probably consider that. And so he's just a really, really good person to engage with on ideas that are trying to fix problems that we have in education and otherwise. So now I bring you Freddie deBoer. I'm here with Freddie deBoer. Freddie, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I've been looking forward to this.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. So you've written a wonderful book, The Cult of Smart: How Our Broken Education System Perpetuates Social Injustice. This came out right before the pandemic, right?
It came out in a very not very good timing to put a book out time. It came out exactly the right time for me to be able to do zero promo anywhere. Yeah.
Oh, that's terrible.
Unfortunately, yeah.
Yeah,
them's the breaks,
Yeah, that's right. Well, all of it has been read and talked about, I guess, online, which is good and bad. But it's a great book, and I definitely want to get to it. So before we do, let's talk about just a little bit about you. So just tell listeners who you are, what your background is, and what you currently do.
Sure. My name is Freddie deBoer. I usually define myself as a writer and academic. I have a PhD in English where I focused on assessment of student learning with a particular focus on tests of college learning, and wrote a dissertation about one of those tests, the Collegiate Learning Assessment Plus. I am a Marxist, which I'm sure we'll get into sort of what that means. I come from a lefty family and grew up in lefty sort of enclaves. I have been an activist of one sort or the other since I was a teenager. I have found myself associated with a certain kind of how do I even put it? As a critic of the left from the left is how I'm usually most often sort of defined, and how people come to find my work, as I am a civil libertarian and think that a lot of the basic principles of left-wing thought have been corrupted in the last several decades.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I've read the criticisms about you, and I don't know. I don't know how fair they are or aren't. I think people do a lot of flattening out of people and their beliefs and stuff. So it'll be interesting to hear you talk about some of it. So yeah, let's start with the kind of the Marxist stuff. Now, you don't, at least in the United States, I mean, I'm sure you hear it for some people, but more often than not, you don't hear people kind of claim that title. Now, I think that's different, right? So I think if you were to ask kind of your average person what a Marxist is, they'll probably have some very pedestrian view of it, some very kind of, communism, hammer sickle, Red Scare, 1950s kind of thing, which is maybe fair a little bit. But then you might ask other people and they'll give you some kind of, Hegelian, actual, Marxist thought from, some type of critical theory of sorts. And so I guess, how do you define Marxism? Maybe talk about the various forms, some of the ones I've just mentioned, and how do you kind of apply it and use it? I'll say here, Zizek is probably one of the bigger, well-known people, but people are like, is he really a Marxist? Is he just more Hegelian? So there's always kind of infighting of sorts. So just tell me how you define it and how you define yourself that way.
Well, I'll start by saying that I know next to nothing about Hegel, so you won't be getting into it.
Okay, that's fair. Fair enough.
Marxism is a theory of history before it's anything else. Okay, Marxism is a theory of history and how history works. That theory of history implies an economic theory. Okay, so according to me, understanding Marxism as a theory of history comes first, and the economics are implied and comes second. Marxism is a view of history that suggests that it's often called dialectical materialism. So it's a materialist in the sense that, unlike German idealism, as in Kant or Hegel, it is concerned with sort of material reality, and it is also famously atheist. Trotsky wrote, "I am a Marxist and thus necessarily an atheist." Right, atheism is implied into the theory. But Marxism is a way of looking at the world that says that the history of the world can be defined by looking at the sort of conflict of different economic classes over time. And that if you pass through various stages of human history, like feudalism, which Marx does at some length in places like the Capital books, you see that it is competing economic classes that power history and that are basically the vector of history. This is a kind of a banal thing to say now that a lot of people don't sort of interpret as being a big deal, but it is a big deal sort of when compared to some of his predecessors. Marx is kind of like Freud, and they are both kind of like a really influential movie like The Matrix or something, where they're so influential that if you are sort of immersed in the stuff that came after them, they appear less revolutionary in thought because they were so influential. Yeah. As I said before, if someone says, I'm not communist, I'm capitalist, right? And capitalism will win the war against communism. That's at least a Marxian way of thinking about the world. In other words, like prior to Marx, thinking about the world as like being made up of these clashing ideologies that are dialectical. So in other words, they meet each other. That in and of itself is sort of a Marxian sort of idea. So again, sort of an idea that most people won't bat an eye at, but which is actually a vestige of Marxism. Marxism sees the world as being defined by, or at least the capitalist world is defined by exploitation, which means something very specific. Marx was a believer in the labor theory of value. He was hardly the first or the last to espouse the labor of a theory of value. For example, Adam Smith, who many people define as the sort of free market capitalist sort of economist, did a lot of work on the labor theory of value. Labor theory of value simply states that if we look at capitalism and the way it happens, it's all about a series of exchanges that are considered to be in some sense equivalent between the people who are making the exchange. In other words, if I go to a store and I want to buy an apple, right, there is some price that I'm going to buy that apple for. Reasonable people can reasonably disagree about what the actual price of the apple should be, but there has to be a sense between both the store owner and myself that we can arrive at an equivalent exchange, right? I have to be able to feel comfortable saying, yes, I am willing to turn over this dollar or whatever for an apple, because we have in our heads a sense of what is worth it and what is not, right? And a lot of being a consumer means operating in a system in which you're constantly making choices. Yes, this product or service is worth the cost, or no, it's not, etc. The issue is that we also have the concept of profit, right? So we have the concept of equivalent exchange, and we also have the concept of profit, meaning that value is created, right? So one of the basic questions that the labor theory of value asks is, if there's such a thing as equivalent exchange, then where does profit come from? So if we look at a classic, and we'll put this back in sort of industrial era terms, because that's where communism grew out of, or Marxism grew out of, industrial era England specifically. You have your factory. It's on a piece of land that has a certain value that you paid for or you are leasing it. There's machinery that you paid to have built. There are raw materials that you paid for. And then finally, there are workers who use those things in order to create a widget, something you sell, right? All of those things have a price tag attached to them. But in order for capitalism to work, the factory owner must derive more value from selling the widget than he put into it, right? I mean, obviously, that's how the system works. So the question is where does that increase in value come from? How is it that these collections of things that have a certain price that we can put on them, including the labor value of the workers, how is it that leads to the creation of profit and greater value? And what Marx said, and what the labor theory of value says, is that this is the product of the workers. Because if you think about it, who is the agent within this process, right? What is the part of the process of creation of profit who actually has the ability to create change in the world? And it's the workers. The raw materials will just sit there if you don't touch them, right? Certainly in the industrial era, you needed human beings to work the machinery, etc. And so what Marx says is that, and Engels and subsequent Marxists, this is fundamentally a kind of a con job. This is an unfair exchange, right? Because the workers are creating the value, but the person who captures the greatest part of the value is the ownership class, the capitalist class, the people who own the factory, the land, etc. And Marx sees capitalist society as basically a economic war between these two sides of the equations. The capitalist class, the bourgeoisie, he calls them, the ownership class that fundamentally derives its value from owning things, and the working class, or the proletariat, who fundamentally derive their value by exchanging their labor force for a wage. And according to Marx, it doesn't matter how generous a boss is, right? The wage that he's giving to his workers can never sort of equivalently compensate them for the amount of profit they're creating, because if that did happen, the factory would be insolvent, right? In other words, there would be no profit if the workers were being paid equivalently to the amount of value that they're creating. From this, all Marxism flows, okay? This is like the fundamental vision of the world that communism is based on, for example. I should say Marxism is the intellectual and philosophical theory of Karl Marx and his followers. Marxism is a description of the world. Communism is the political program of Marxism, right? So Marxism is the what, communism is the how.
So is that why you make the distinction of calling yourself a Marxist as opposed to a communist?
Yes. And in fact, I don't think, there have been times in my life when I've called myself a communist, but I would no longer do so, because in order to be a communist, there would have to be a communist movement, and there is none, right? It's like me calling myself a communist now is me like saying I'm a member of the Whig Party in American history. Right? Yeah, it doesn't mean anything, because absent the vehicle itself.
Right.
So, and the communism is a dead letter across the world. So, which I'm sure we'll talk about.
Yeah.
So anyway, Marxism is fundamentally about identifying this fundamental unfairness, what Marx calls the rate of exploitation, and coming up with an alternative to that, which is based fundamentally on shared ownership of the means of production. And when we say the means of production, we just mean the productive apparatus of society that makes society work. So one thing that is not the case, that many people assume to be true in Marxism or in a communist system, Marxism does not call for the abolition of private property. After the communist revolution, you don't have to share your pants with somebody else. Okay, like you still get to keep your POG collection. It's the parts of society that are responsible for the generation of productive stuff in the world. Now, this is one of the many places where, in the conditions under which Marx wrote, it made a lot more sense than it does now, right? Because it was very obvious what the means of production were in the 1850s England, right? They were big industrial factories with big machines, and that created the widgets, et cetera, et cetera. Nowadays, the productive apparatus is far more decentralized and spread out. My computer, right, is my computer part of the means of production? Right, is one of the big questions, because I am creating profit from using this machine, right? However, even setting aside that difficulty, it is not the case that you just simply don't own anything in a Marxist society. It's simply that the things that are needed to secure the better good for everyone, like factories, like the sewage system, like the electrical grid, etc., is mutually owned by everyone. It's important to say that the Marxist future is very purposefully underdefined within classical Marxism. So if we're looking specifically at Marx and Engels, which is the kind of the flavor of Marxist that I am, I'm very stripped down and sort of old school. They did not define what a Marxist society would look like in very specific terms. And Marx says specifically that he doesn't want to do that because he doesn't think that he has a crystal ball. He doesn't think that he can properly predict what the world will look like after the revolution, although he does give some guesses and some ideas. The closest that you can kind of derive, in my opinion, from the original texts is sort of an implication of like semi-autonomous groups that are governed by direct democracy, that where individuals are allowed to leave and go to another group if they want, and where they proceed according to the basic principle of, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. So in other words, you contribute what you can and you get what you need. Mm-hmm. But it's all very underdrawn. Mm-hmm. And there's one of the reasons why Marxism is famous for having internal internecine battles is because of that reason, because the future is not spelled out exactly. And if you look at the Russian experience in Marxism, which is a profoundly failed Marxist state that was the USSR, you had at the center of things, you had like one of the things that was happening in 1917 and in the years immediately after that is that people were saying, oh shit, we actually have to do this now. What does it look like? Mm-hmm. And that, of course, led to some major schisms. So, for example, Trotsky, who fled Russia after Stalin took power and was ultimately assassinated by Stalin in Mexico. He had this idea of the theory of permanent revolution, and Stalinism had this concept of socialism in one country and state capitalism, which just means you basically still have a state, a capitalist system. It's just administered by the state. I promise I'm winding this up soon.
You're good.
The reason why you have to have a theory like a theory of state capitalism or a theory of socialism in one country is part of the problem with the implementation of a Marxist project is that Marx believed that when one country saw a Marxist revolution, it would inspire all the other countries to, in a sort of cascading series of dominoes, which is kind of funny, dominoes falling, you would see a cascade of Marxism across the globe. And of course, like some people who famously took that idea very seriously included like the CIA, right? So socialism in the Marxist tradition was not intended to be a one country sort of thing. Right. And so a lot of the immediate problems for a USSR, for a China, or for North Korea, et cetera, stem from the fact that they're fundamentally, their conditions are incompatible with the basic teachings of what Marx and Engels said, which is that, the nation state is illegitimate and will fall away as the workers unite, et cetera. I will finish by saying, there's just a lot of sort of misinformation about what Marxism necessarily entails, like that you can't have private property. Another really big one, like if you listen to Jordan Peterson, for example, he's always attacking Marxism by saying, well, the idea of perfect equality is impossible. Marxism has essentially nothing to do with equality, right? I think it's really important to say this. Marxism, equality is simply not a political goal of Marxism. What you have after you end this cycle of exploitation will be more equal, in fact. But both Marx and Engels independently arrived at the conclusion that equality is a nonsensical political goal, right? Because any difference between two people can be expressed as an inequality. Right. And we're not going to suddenly just become all the same after the Marxist revolution. Personally, I think even in like a perfectly pulled off communist post-state, post-capitalist society, you would have a lot of summative inequality because human beings are different in what they're able to do, for example. So that's like a frustration of mine is the fixation on equality. But the basic idea is just like, look, like, Marx was coming up at a time when the world was changing furiously. The transformation of the English landscape in the 19th century was just incredible with the sort of the power of capitalism to change the landscape. Marx was entranced by capitalism. He thought that it was an incredible productive engine, which is another thing that's really important to say is Marx insisted that you have to have a period of capitalism before you have a period of before you can switch to communism, which is why some people say the USSR failed because they tried to go from an impoverished feudal state into a communist system without taking advantage of the immense productive opportunities of capitalism first. But Marx was looking around at a world where the working conditions were truly horrific, and where the inequality was incredible, and came up with what he thought of would be a better system. But like I said, the system itself that comes after is kind of underdrawn. To me, the heart of Marxism is the observations about the way that history and economics work, and the fundamental nature of exploitation at the heart of capitalist exchange.
So it's a wonderful way in which you describe all of it, because I think you're getting a lot there, which I think will be really interesting for listeners to hear, to say, wow, like there's a lot of bullshit out there about about Marxism. I have two follow-up questions here. So kind of coming to the modern day. So in terms of, how does a Marxist walk around in the world today, in basically almost 2023? And, what do we say about, so let's, I mean, you can use as much time as you want on this, but, there have been some people that have suggested or claimed that China's not really communist, right? Or that they're, that's just kind of their party, but they're basically just a capitalist economically, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this idea of, again, I bring them up because they're, the largest and most populous country on the planet, and they're run by a communist party. So thoughts on that, I guess, just briefly, or as long as you want. And then I guess about socialism, which is another, I think, sort of branch somewhere in here. And there's so many different variants of this. You have socialism in different Latin American countries currently. You have socialism in obviously Scandinavia and Western Europe, of some branch of that or some version of that. And so forth. So, what do we say about socialism, maybe on an applied sense, and how does socialism have so many different, variants to it as well? So tackle maybe those two.
So the first thing that I'll say in regards to the first question is, I should say for context, I tell young leftists all the time that they don't have to be Marxists. I wrote a piece about this, I think last year. I think that Marxism is true and describes the world better than any other system in terms of identifying the fundamental powers that shape the world and the antagonism between them at the heart of it. But also Marxism is a dead religion, and I don't know why anyone would bother to worship it anymore. Okay. I will never cease to be a Marxist, but I'm also one of the last of a dying race of monks or whatever, living on an island somewhere. You know what I'm saying? I think that a Marxist revolution is not in the cards in anything like short order. And so what we need to do is find ways for people to be radicals, leftists, socialists in ways that don't necessarily need to follow from the Marxist model. I would think of it like a public relations firm. We're just not going to get the world past its allergy to the term communism, guys. Okay. Like that's not, that's not going to happen. All right.
Yes.
It is, history presses forward. And I think that in many ways, the drift is still to the left certainly for the developed world, and in ways that are far too slow for people like me, but which are still meaningful. I would just say, yes, I do think that if you are a young leftist, you should have a basic understanding of Marx and be able to be at least a little bit conversant in it, just because it'll be useful to you. But I don't proselytize, right? I have Substack, and I post 3 or 4 times a week. I just about never say, and here's why you should be a Marxist. So that's sort of how I sort of walk around in 2022 or 2023. The question of, is this such or such country actually communism? Has communism ever been failed? Well, I would answer that in a few ways. I think I can definitely understand that it can be a cop-out to identify every actually existing attempt at communism and saying that one wasn't really communism, so it doesn't count. Mm-hmm. And I can understand how that's frustrating. I can also say that, look, if you want to criticize communism as put into practice, you can say whether or not the USSR was an actually communist state, it was a very intense attempt at a communist state that failed. Mm-hmm. China, it was an attempt or is an attempt at a communist state. Vietnam was an attempt at a communist state, etc. Cuba. Mm-hmm. And they have had varying levels of success. I think there are a lot of things, for example, in Cuban society that work quite well. But anyway, we have not had the revolution, right? So you can critique it on those grounds. Mm-hmm. I do think that it is fair to say that when you look at China and you see a country with billionaires and homeless people, right? You're not seeing what would be described as an orthodox communist experience going on there, right? In other words, I think that the defense is just, forget about sort of defending communism or Marxism. It is just literally true that the minimal conditions for what Marx thought of as a Marxist revolution have never been accomplished. But again, that doesn't rescue it from the critique, right? Because you can still say, the fact that it was so that it's so hard to make this happen implies that it's unrealistic and will never be achieved anyway. I think that's an argument people make, and that's fine. Mm-hmm. So socialism, I have a very simple definition of socialism, and it's just one word, which is decommodification, which means a socialist state is one in which, in whole or in part, gradually or all at once, various industries that are currently in private hands are brought into government control or public ownership. Okay, so for example, in many places, the water and sewage system is not privatized in any way at all. Right, in many places in the world, the provisioning of water and the systems through which waste is disposed of are already fully nationalized, right? They're already fully sort of handled. Mm-hmm. Now, the city might charge you for your water bill, but fundamentally, it's in the public hands, right? Yeah. But you can easily imagine a world where, just with your with your internet, right, coming to your house. Mm-hmm. Some people could say, oh, I have Spectrum water, right, and I have, I only have 100% pure Dasani sent to my house. Right? Provisioning of that could be in private hands, but it's not, right? Decommodification means that some industries, and which ones depends on who you talk to and who you ask, is that some industries are moved into a state of public control, public ownership for public good and public distribution. So a good example of that, of a place where we have an example of a public system, is the NHS in the United Kingdom. Now, there's all kinds of subsystems that have been privatized out, and they've been trying to privatize more and more of it, et cetera, et cetera. But fundamentally, the NHS is a system of health that is not just funded by government, but is in fact run by government, right? In other words, it's not just that the government pays for your health insurance and then you go to a private provider, and the NHS has doctors that it employs directly, et cetera, right?
It's government run. It is government run insurance.
Right. So that would be an example of socialized medicine, right? Yep. So the process is move things in or out. Now, how does all this work in practice? There's so many people who are so much smarter than me on these questions. I don't want to blunder around too much. There's a guy named Seth Ackerman who has done excellent work on describing how market socialism might work, or Peter Frace is another one. One of the fundamental critiques of a sort of a communist state is you end up with an overseer board of some kind that dictates where resources go, right? Mm-hmm. You have a command economy. Mm-hmm. And it turns out that in most cases, almost all cases, not all cases, but most cases, markets are just vastly more efficient and effective at saying who should receive what within the economy in terms of resources, right? So rather than there being a board saying, okay, we're going to put these many people to work on this farm over here, and we're going to have this many people work on this farm over here, and we're going to try to guess what crops we want the different people to have, etc. You have the market, and you sort of let that dictate where resources go. There's a lot of energy in market socialism, in which the industries are owned, but in which you can still use the power of markets in order to determine and distribute who ends up getting what in terms of where the actual sort of industrial energy goes, etc. I'm not going to try to summarize them because I'm not as versed enough in them as I could be, but I do think I am a stickler for saying that decommodification is the organizing feature of socialism, and that if you can have a nice social democratic state, right? Like we could turn the United States into a social democracy like Iceland or Norway or Sweden. But those tend to be much more just about maintaining a capitalist system in which the government just pays for more stuff, maybe has a nice big sovereign wealth fund so that they own more stuff also. But we're fundamentally, you're still talking about the same basic currency exchange and the same basic market systems, where it's just the government is the payer of last resort in some fields. I tend to think that you need to be decommodifying things, moving the current practices out of the private domain into the public to call it socialism.
Yeah, isn't the argument, which seems strong, but maybe it's just too pedestrian, is that the reason we can't do that in the United States is because we're too big in our democratic society. We have just too many chefs in the kitchen. People are having their own ideas, too many big interest groups, 330 million people. There's too many different, local and geographical kinds of issues. People, and we're not homogenized and things like that. You look at Iceland's got, under 500,000 people. I think Norway's got under 5 million people, and they're all, not terribly ethnically diverse and different. So are those like legitimate criticisms? Is like United States, you can't really do that with such a big, diverse, broad, huge country.
I would like to believe that the diversity element does not have to be a problem. In other words, I could totally be convinced that, racial resentment, etc., could make that a problem in real life right now. But I would like to believe that we can reach a certain place of wisdom in race where that's no longer a problem. I don't think that those are illegitimate critiques. I think that those are a good example of critiques where the abundance argument comes into play, meaning as we become more and more and more abundant, the arguments for denying certain people the resources they need to live become weaker and weaker. So I'll give you like a concrete example for what I'm talking about. In the 1930s in America, one farmer could grow enough food in 1 year to feed 4 people for 1 year. Okay, so the ratio of the number of farmers to the number of people they could feed working in 1 year and feeding for 1 year was 1 to 4. Nowadays, it's closer to 1 to 125, right? The incredible potential, the incredible productive apparatus of capitalism has dramatically diminished the amount of people that we need in order to grow enough food to eat as a species, and well, at least in the United States anyway. And so as that happens, right, the argument for, we can't give everyone enough food to live for free, it's too expensive, becomes harder and harder to maintain, right? And I think that generalized out, you look at the productive capacity of the world around us. You look at the things that we can do now that we couldn't do before. I mean, again, like Russia was an extremely poor country when the revolution happened, I mean, it had been suffering from famine even during the SARS era, had suffered horrific losses in World War I, etc. No shit, it didn't work, right?
Right.
The more productive that we become, the more that abundance in and of itself becomes an argument for why would we ever have anyone who can't have enough food to eat if we're in a scenario where it's become this sort of, but again, like this is a sort of pro-capitalist element of a good socialist argument, right? In other words, like I said, Marx recognized that you had to use the incredible potential of capitalism to level up society and to develop the economy and the country and the productive apparatus before you could have a communist system. The $1 million question is when are you productive enough to then have a fully socialized system?
Yeah. It's very interesting. It's very fascinating. I mean, it's one of the reasons it's interesting for all the content aspects, but is I just don't hear you you're saying you have a Substack and I just don't hear you talking about this. So it's really cool to hear you kind of talk about something that you're identifying with, and you explain it very, very well.
Thanks.
Okay, let's shift gears to the book and I guess education at large. Obviously, there's so much to talk about, so I'll try and streamline this. So let's just get right there to, I guess, the thesis or the central tenet of your book. You call it the cult of smart. So what the hell is this? And just kind of talk about aspects of academic attainment and intelligence and all these things.
So I'm working on my second book right now. And
very nice. What's it on? Can you share what it's on?
It's about why social movements fail. Right?
Oh, interesting.
And the fact that I could do that right there, you say one sentence, because one of the reasons I'm excited for this new book is I never figured out the elevator pitch for the cult of smart. It went on the market more than 2 years ago. I started writing it more than 5 years ago. Yeah. It's got a lot of moving parts. So what is the cult of smart? The cult of smart is several different things. The first thing the cult of smart is that it is a recognition of how the sort of Fordist economy, the manufacturing heavy economy, the industry economy collapsed as a major employer in the United States in the last decades of the 20th century. So we actually are still a big manufacturing hub in the United States. We still make a lot of things, but the percentage of people employed in manufacturing and industry is a small fraction of what it was, right? Mm-hmm. We just don't employ that many people anymore. So for a long period of time, we had this sort of social system in which if you graduated from high school, or even if you didn't, and you knew that you were not academically inclined, you had another out, which was the famous factory at the edge of town, right? Yeah. So in my hometown of Middletown, Connecticut, Pratt & Whitney, who makes engines for fighter jets, they are like the factory at the edge of town, right? Mm-hmm. One of my best friends, Dad, never went to college, but when he got out of high school, he went and he got a job on the assembly line at Pratt & Whitney. He worked there for 40 years and worked his way up. And by the end of his time there, he had a title that included the word engineer in it, mm-hmm. even though he didn't have he just had a high school degree, no college degree. Whereas no one would ever come into the company now as a engineer without a college degree at least, right? Mm-hmm. Well, that this phenomenon of the factory at the edge of town sort of shrivels up and goes away, which Bruce Springsteen has written approximately 100 songs about in his life, right? Why does that happen? Well, the uncontroversial reason is because of automation, which is that we just got way better at building machines that can build things, right? That over and over and over again, we discovered new ways to make positions redundant. Human beings are expensive. Machines can be cheaper, and when they're cheaper, they will replace human beings. The more controversial part of that is offshoring, which is that we have this Reagan-Thatcherite globalization revolution, what a lot of people call neoliberal economics. And one of the things that happens is the tariff walls get torn down, the protectionism gets dismantled. You have things like NAFTA is passed. And a lot of those jobs were sent elsewhere. They're sent to Mexico, to China, to Bangladesh, et cetera. One way or the other, we employ a lot less people in manufacturing and than we used to. And what that had enabled was that it enabled non-academically inclined people to be able to, just like my friend's dad, like I was mentioning, he owns his own home, has a couple cars, put 3 sons through college, was able to have that solid middle-class lifestyle without a college degree. Once that is going away at pretty much the exact same time, you have the birth of the crisis narrative in American education. So in the 1970s, if you're a high school student, there's almost zero assessment going on of you in almost anywhere in the country. Okay. Like you have a GPA, what your parents know it, but no one is systematically tracking your performance. And you might not even know what your class rank is. It might not even be being calculated. Nowadays, we have a system, although it's been challenged a lot recently, of tons and tons and tons of data gathering. And this is all to feed the maw of this crisis narrative. So in the early 1980s, the Reagan administration puts out a extremely influential pamphlet's the wrong word, and so his book, but an extremely influential report called A Nation at Risk. And A Nation at Risk argues that the United States, one of the biggest threats facing the United States is that we're losing the education war to the Soviets, of course, but also just generally, that our schools are failing, that we're falling behind, that there's a generalized crisis across education. Just about everything in that report was later challenged as having been sort of argued on false empirical grounds. But it helped to create this sort of sense of constant panic about how American schools are doing.
It's like right-wing propaganda at the time.
Yes, that's right. And what this means is that we now have no manufacturing and industrial base for young high school graduates to go into anymore, like their fathers did. We now also have the idea of college is the way. And so as I researched in the book, every president since Ronald Reagan at least has argued that college is sending kids to college and a great education, et cetera, that is the economic plan for the nation, that this is like education is the thing that will sort of save us. So one thing that the cult of smart means is it means that it's the scenario we arrived in where we have an economy that only really benefits and works for those who have a certain kind of academic or cognitive ability. But the cult of smart is also a cultural sort of set of assumptions that attends this, which I talked about in the book. I tell a story. I was at a cookout when I was in grad school with a bunch of other grad students there with their families, people that I knew. There was a family that I didn't know there where the dad was getting his PhD in the sciences or something. But it was him and his wife and his 2 little boys. And the wife we were sort of standing around and the wife was talking and bragging about the older son. And she was saying, he's the top in his class. He's already programming. He's in a junior robotics club, talking about how smart he was, what a brilliant man he was, whatever. And then her other son came running by, making like goofy noises with his mouth. And she said, that one is maybe not so smart, about her younger son. And what you could see this ripple go out among the faces of all the Americans standing around, like this.
Of course.
People clenching up and looking like, it just seemed like the sort of thing you don't say about your own child, right? He's not so smart.
Right.
But what I was thought about that story later on, and I was teaching a bunch of students, I had been for years, and I was writing this dissertation on educational measurement, et cetera. And it just occurred to me, if she had said her son didn't have an ear for music, right, would never be a musician, right, or couldn't hold a tune, right, I wouldn't have noticed, and nobody else would have either. That wouldn't have been controversial. Mm-hmm. If she said that he wasn't a great athlete, people wouldn't have had that sort of that ripple of, oh my God. If she said that he doesn't have like an eye for design, or he'll never be a great graphic artist, whatever, nobody would really care about it that much. There's all these characteristics of him that she could have just sort of defined negatively that wouldn't have produced that reaction in me and other people. Mm. What produces that reaction is smart, right? Mm. Because we have developed a culture where smart is seen as this totalizing existential thing, even though we know there are all manner of other things that make human beings valuable. So when I talk about the cult of smart, one of the things that I'm talking about is just the implied notion that being smart is the most important thing in the world. Mm-hmm. And that anyone who's not smart is someone who's facing failure, who's not going to achieve their dreams, who's maybe not socially desirable in that way. And part of the point of the book is to be an argument for saying, like, look, human beings are also compassionate and courageous and considerate and patient and kind and creative and perceptive and cool-headed and generous of spirit, etc. Right? And that these things matter, and that the system right now is designed to, at least until you're into your early adulthood, define you entirely by your relationship to smart. Mm.
Yeah, so there's a few things there. So absolutely, right? This is this is stuff that my parents were told, their generation. This is stuff that they told me, and even people in my generation a little bit, that everyone's telling their kids, you go to school and you get a college degree, and that's how you make something of yourself, and that's how you get a good job and have a good life, all those things. Which I don't think is a bad thing, and I don't think you're saying it's a bad thing. I think, but we need to have a way to have a kind of all options approach on this stuff, right? Where if you can't do it, or you're not able to, or you don't have the desire or the motivation or the capacity, that you can still have a livable wage, right? You can still be able to live and support yourself and family and things like that. Because not everyone's going to be a scientist, not everyone's going to be a lawyer, and we shouldn't want that. And we should put value and respect on all types of jobs that are all needed. If you're a roofer or a plumber or an electrician or whatever, those things are also just as valuable. So I guess there, we can talk about some of the basic capacity things, but I guess in terms of the piece of where people are at, of why that's been pushed, I think that at the time, maybe that was right. No, like we should have pushed people, generations, to say, look, don't just do this, like go to school, get an education. And as the world has changed, that just kind of like, that train left the station and now it doesn't have any brakes on it. Right. Or we don't have any way of saying like, well, you get to the train station and you can take any one of these trains, right? It doesn't have to just be this one train on education. You can do any one of these. Why can't we kind of reel that back in to say, like, there is value in this? And this is sort of a bigger question, so I don't want to ask too much at one time, but also, where do we see that in other countries in the world where they, I'm thinking of Germany is what comes to mind at first, but, where they also have a different way of doing it?
Yeah. So, the analogy that I would use is if you ever play like a role-playing game, mm-hmm. and you build your party like a computer role-playing game. In that scenario, you have your strong guy, right? A lot of strength, and you have your guy who's very stealthy, or mm-hmm. very got dexterity or whatever, and you have your guy with a lot of intelligence, right? And within that sort of context, right, you see them as intelligence is important, but it's no more important than anything else. And they're all legitimate ways to sort of build, And I kind of want our society to be like the player playing the RPG and sort of seeing different ways to be valuable, but equivalent ways to be valuable. So I'm a really big believer in expanding the number of pathways, right, through school, so that we recognize that different people have different sets of things they're good at, things they aren't good at.
Right.
We see that there's these choke points which are causing real harm with people who are forced to learn difficult skills that most of us don't use, and which are keeping a lot of kids from graduating. So algebra, for example. Nobody uses algebra. I mean, like,
what do you mean, Freddie? I use algebra every single day when I wake up. You don't use it every day?
I do not. Even a lot of people in fairly technical fields, like programmers, don't use algebra. I think that where we set the sort of the bar at what we think everyone should do and know how to do. Obviously, I think we should attempt to teach everyone long division, right? But where that bar is set is, of course, debatable, and we can hash it out. Right. But you look at these algebra requirements in high school. Okay, Andrew Hacker is an economist. I think he wrote a book called The Math Myth maybe a decade ago, and he was demonstrating how much damage math requirements do in American schools, where we have so many students who end up taking extra years to graduate or dropping out entirely because they can't pass their algebra requirements. So he assembled some amazing numbers. For example, for the year of data that he looked at, 67% of Arizona high school students were failing their algebra requirement. 67%, right? And so this is the process for me of trying to constantly fit square pegs into round holes rather than coming up with some square holes in which they can fit, right? So when I was in high school, we had this vocational agricultural program that was attached to the school, and it was vocational agricultural. So you could learn skills in engine repair, or you could learn skills in like agricultural fields. There was some stigma associated with it. I think it's fair to say that, people who did VOAG were seen as a certain kind of person, but it was a set of skills that they could learn and do that made progress towards graduation, that were not sort of held hostage to overly onerous standards. And we have good examples about how this sort of thing can work. So in the German system, they have a tracking system, which is based on whether or not you're going to go on an academic path or a vocational path.
Right.
Now, the vocational path pushes people towards industry and helps them to sort of use their time in high school to learn how to be better and more efficient workers when they get into a more vocational manufacturing sort of jobs later. Where in the academic path is more of a traditional liberal arts education. Right. Now, it's important to say I would only support this sort of a system in the United States if it's what we call soft tracking, meaning the parents get to decide. So it's not that we're just saying, you're on this path and you have no choice about it.
Right.
The individual still gets to choose through the parents.
Correct. Right.
From everything that I've talked to, there isn't any stigma associated with the German system for the students who go on the vocational path. Now, it's important to say Germany has much more powerful labor unions than we do.
Yes.
And so these students are graduating out of high school and going to go work for BMW or whoever, and they're going into unionized workplaces where they're able to have a better level of pay, et cetera, than we do. And they also have, socialized medicine, et cetera, like a lot of
there's the social networks, but also I think maybe an element of like a cultural historical piece as well, because after the unification in Germany in 1871, they had this absolute explosion of industry. And from what we still see today, such as with, various types of manufacturing plants, obviously with different types of engineering. And that's like the whole German brand, right? So you have like an Audi, a BMW, a Mercedes-Benz, and then other types of products as well. That wasn't that long ago, 150 years ago. So I have to imagine that there's like it's viewed favorably because it's so recently. Whereas in the United States, we have that, but there's a lot of ups and downs with how that's viewed.
What's strange is that, you can understand why culturally there's, support for industry and manufacturing as a noble career for an adult in Germany, because it's Germany, right? And they are famous for their manufacturing. Right. I mentioned BMW, there's Mercedes. Right. There's all manner of sort of famous German-made things. But of course, we also have that in the United States. We have that tradition with Detroit or whatever. But I do think that there is a certain degree of stigma associated with vocational training. Yeah. Speaking of like international comparisons, right? If you want to look at Finland for a good example of a system where I think the cult of smart is much less prevalent. Finland has the best, depending on what metric you look at, but some of the best or the best educational metrics in the world. Right. Okay. It's perfectly common for a Finnish 6-year-old not to be able to read. Okay. If I'm here in Park Slope, Brooklyn, okay, like the land of bougie liberal parents, right? And if their kid's not reading by 3 or 4,
it's a catastrophe.
They'll take them to a doctor. They'll send them to specialists, whatever. Right. In the Finnish system, they're not even trying to teach the kids at the youngest level to read because it'll come around, right? It'll happen eventually. Right. And it's like, it's that sort of like not treating every step of development as though it has to happen at the same point for everybody, and that it's a disaster if it doesn't happen. I think it would be a lot better for everybody.
Yeah. No, I absolutely agree on that bit. So let's talk about, I guess, a little bit. We can get to some fun waters here. You mentioned in the book underserved kids, missed in education system. Okay, I'll give you some runway in this. So how do we have this honest conversation? It ties into what we we're just saying about kids that have, or people, individuals, but kids, let's say, that have limited capacity, right?
This is why some people just can't get past, right? This is the part that a lot of people just can't get on board with. In anything, there's a distribution of ability. Right. There's nothing that human beings do where there's not some degree to which different people are better or worse at those things. And one of the things that the book is trying to do is to be frank and adult in saying some people are better at school than other people. Right. And again, this is something where in so many other domains, there's no controversy to be had in making this point. The classic example being athletics, right? Yeah. We know some people are just better at some sports than other people. You can kind of feel bad for somebody who wanted to be a baseball player and isn't that good at baseball, but it's not that big of a deal. People can talk about it, but because of obviously the histories of pseudoscientific racism, the history of eugenics, etc., a lot of nasty, some of the early progressive movement stuff, some of the nastier history. A lot of people are understandably a little bit uptight about this stuff. Sure. I would argue that when it's not presented to them as an explicitly political question, most people understand that some people are just smarter than others if we define smart in terms of the schooling system and the academics that it teaches. So one of the big critiques I get of the book a lot is, well, there's many different ways to be smart. And that's true. There are a lot of different ways to be smart, but the way that I'm talking about is the way that's rewarded economically in our system, right? Academically, culturally, and economically in our system, where the great winners of our society today, if they're not celebrities, are like people who kick ass in high school, go to Stanford, and end up being a programmer for Google, right? Like, so that path. We know some people are better than that at that than other people. The big sort of paradox of education right now, of American education, is that we want education to create equality. And this is, there's just an immense amount of effort that goes into making our system one that creates equality. But also the entire purpose of our system is to identify excellence, right? And to give reward to people who are excellent. Those are totally contradictory goals, right? In other words, if you want to be able to say, these kids are the gifted ones, these kids are the ones who have excelled the most of anyone in their studies, and we're going to reward them with a seat in an elite college, which will then propel them to a great career. You cannot then say that the system as a whole is a tool for equality. It doesn't make sense, right?
Right.
And that's sort of at the heart of everything. But I think that most people just kind of casually know some people are smarter than others. They're just not likely to put it on their Twitter account, right? Like, even parents, right? If you can get them to be really frank, will tell you that one of their kids is smarter than the other one, right? Sometimes that happens where, hey, this one is just smarter than the other one. Mm-hmm. What I would like, right, is a healthy system where more people had the sort of attitude that Chinese mother had about her two sons, where I have no reason to believe at all that she loved the other one less because she said that he was less academically inclined. Right. Rather than sort of say, hey, look, being academically inclined is one way, mm-hmm. but there's other ways, right? Mm-hmm. And they have equal value, and the people who don't have that have equal value as well. But it's difficult. I mean, if you look at someone like Raj Chetty, Raj Chetty is a sociologist. I believe he's at Stanford, and he might have gone to Harvard. He has made a huge name for himself by identifying, using, he believes, to be sophisticated methods to show what sort of educational effects work and which don't. And he's a big sort of booster of the idea that we can get everybody up to speed in school and increase all these scores and stuff like that. A person like that, which is very much the dominant ideology in academia, which is that, like, you don't talk about natural limits. You don't talk about the fact that there's a distribution and there will always be a distribution of ability. I would just love to pin someone like that down and say, like, look, like, can it really possibly be true that summatively, right, whatever the reasons, whatever the influences, summatively, everyone is exactly the same at school in terms of their underlying ability? Mm-hmm. Because the problem with when you say that, if that might sound sort of progressive to say everybody is equally smart underneath, the problem is that when you say that, you are then implying that if they fail at school, it's their fault, right? Yeah. I mean, part of the reason, one of the things that attracted me about the book is I'm a big lefty, and I would like if we would do more to support people who, with their basic human needs, like shelter, food, education, etc., healthcare. Mm-hmm. And I think that the case for those things is strengthened if you acknowledge that not everybody is dealt the same hand. This is something where, the Slate Star Codex or Astral Codex 10, this guy, Scott Alexander, mm-hmm. blogger, he's made the point that, if you talk about like someone's weight, right? Mm-hmm. How fat someone is. Liberals tend to say that it's genetic, while conservatives tend to act like it's all hard work, right? Mm-hmm. Like, a liberal will say, okay, that person's fat because, they have a genetic disposition that way. A conservative will say, no, they're just lazy and indolent, whatever. Right. It's the same thing with addiction and alcoholism. Liberals are more likely to chalk that up to genetics than they are to, while the conservatives are more likely to say that it's the fault of the person's individual lack of self-control, whatever. Mm-hmm. Same thing with all manner of other things in life. It tends to be the conservatives who are the ones who say that we control our own destiny, and liberals who see that it's factors beyond our control. But it completely switches around when it comes to academic ability.
That's right.
Right.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
When it comes to academic ability, then liberals are sort of like on the no, everybody has equal chance at everything sort of line. And I don't really understand it.
Yeah, I mean, you've been lumped in with this so-called hereditarian left. Catherine Page Harding is in there. I think Steven Pinker's in there. There's a few people on the left that say, well, there's genetic aspects to this, right? And as soon as people hear genetics, they hear determinism. No matter how much people say that's not what we mean, that's not what that says. There is the role of environment. There is a parallel process with this, and yet you get hit hard with this, right? Like, oh my goodness, there's genetic and biological ideas about intelligence, and oh goodness, don't say that there's different kinds of academic or intelligent abilities between race groups. So that's a whole other issue. You can't say those things at all, and you definitely can't say them on the left because you'll get put on the leper colony. So why do you think that is kind of what you're saying? Like on everything else, it's fine to do that, but on this thing, it's not.
One of the things that I have considered since the book was put out is I believe that the general findings of the sort of behavioral genetics field are correct, which is that everything is the product of gene by environment interactions, but that does mean that all human behavioral traits, including how well they do in school, are influenced by their genome, right? There's this whole sort of field of science that goes over this. You mentioned Catherine Page Hardin, and her book, The Genetic Lottery, is a great primer on that if anyone's interested. That being said, there's a part of me that wishes I could have found a way to write the book without talking about genetics, because it is so all consuming.
It is. Yeah.
It just, for a lot of people, it just ate the entire book.
You're touching the nuclear rods there. I mean, you can't do that. You can't do that. Right.
I mean, look, I just think that, I've written about this at length about this sort of thing. It would seem to me to be astonishing if you believe that our sort of our brains and our spinal columns, our whole neural system, if you believe that those things are built by our DNA, right? DNA to RNA to protein, right? If you think that those things are things that are built according to a genetic code, it would be astonishing if there was no influence of that genetic code that built that instrument on our cognitive functioning, right? I mean,
especially since our intelligence and our brains are what people like to always discuss as what sets us apart from other primates and from other animals on the planet. That's like the thing.
Right. And we know for a fact that in other animals, cognition and behavior are influenced by genes. Like this has been particularly been done with livestock. There's experiments that have demonstrated that animal cognition is influenced by genes. So it would make us very special indeed if that was not the case. Anyhow, but I just think that one of the funny reactions to the book sometimes is sort of people will say, oh, you're saying that there's these people who don't have the same underlying academic ability as other people. Well, you're saying that those people are losers and you're leaving them behind, right? But the whole point of the book is to write a missive about how those people are already being left behind.
Correct. Right.
And what to do about them better. I mean, that's why I wrote the book, is for them.
Well, I think Paige says the same, something similar, not quite that same way, or she has a different angle. But her point is, if we don't talk about these things honestly in terms of the IQ and race and genetics and things like that, then we leave that vacuum open for other people on the other side to talk about it in those kind of scary ways that they used to back in the 20s and 30s. And similar to this point, they're already getting left behind. You can't try to fix those issues if you're not looking at all of the reasons why that's happening. If you're ignoring a major variable, you're not going to be able to effectively help somebody.
So, like a standard issue liberal, so someone who is not a socialist, who does not want to, someone who wants a, better regulated, fairer capitalism. What those liberals will often say is that their particular goal is to level the playing field so that everyone is playing the game of meritocracy at the same level. I don't understand how you can do that without considering the possibility that some people are just having an intrinsic level of ability that influences things. And, as I write about all the time, there's a bizarre amount of sort of not seeing this in a lot of education literature. There was a study that came out, I think last year, looking at social mobility in Denmark, and comparing it to educational mobility. Denmark has the lowest poverty anywhere in the world. It has dramatically lower socioeconomic inequality compared to the United States, even though there are Danish billionaires. The point of this paper was that they found that despite the fact that there was all these things in the Danish economy that made people closer together, educational mobility, meaning the difference between child and parent in their educational performance, was no higher than in the United States. So the whole Danish system, with all of the sort of bells and whistles of redistribution and regulation and social democracy, etc., didn't result in a system where children were likely to outperform their parents in school. And this paper went through a list of like 5 or 6 reasons why this would be the case, but none of them were genetic, right? In other words, you have this finding staring you in the face, right? Like, despite the intense degree of difference between America and Denmark in so many of the economic structures in place, you have the exact same amount of degree to which children and parent are similar in educational metrics. And yet you never stop to think, perhaps that's because the parent is passing on genetic information to the child.
Right. Yeah, it's a lot of not seen, is what it is. I want to ask you about, you touched on it, so you can again riff on this, and you can bring other things in if you want to use examples. But there is on the left, I should say on the progressive left, this obsession with quality, equity, equality of opportunity, all these things. Just how do you understand the differences? And I guess one question I have here specifically on this to follow up is, I feel like maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm just an optimist in me, but like I feel like when people in the Biden administration or other folks, in the Democratic Party, when they say equity, I feel like they're thinking about equality, but that's the new buzzword that everyone uses, equity. And other people on the right will be like, you're absolutely, have totally, lost it. They absolutely want to flatten people, and everyone's, starting the same line and finishes with the same outcomes. And I definitely think there are people out there that do think that, but it's because then when they'll say we need equity, and conservatives are triggered by that. Then when I hear them describe it and talk about it, I'm like, they're just talking about equality as aspirationally. So I don't know. Tell us those definitions and what they actually kind of mean and parse it out, and then how do people actually kind of, I guess, use it tangibly and speak.
I wish I knew. I wish I could do that for you, but I genuinely don't understand what people are talking about anymore. There's this web comic that gets shared a lot. Okay.
Is this the one with people
the baseball
standing?
game?
Oh,
right. There's a baseball game, and there's a fence, and there's keeping people out. And it just like there's one kid who's short, one kid who's medium, one kid who's tall, and so the tall kid can see the game, the kids can't.
They're looking over a fence. They're looking over a fence, to watch a game, and one's on the boxes and one isn't.
Right. And so what happens is like they say, well, equality means you give everyone the same box to stand on. So they all have the same box to stand on, but the short kid is still so short that he can't see the baseball game. Mm-hmm. And then they show equity, which is supposedly that now the short kid gets extra boxes so that he can stand high enough in order to see the baseball game. I have no idea where they are deriving that vision of equality from. There's all manner of things that we do that are designed to promote equality that are more like the equity example, like anything that's means tested, for example. So if you have some sort of, for example, free versus reduced price lunch, right? So in K through 12 schools, there's the federal school lunch program, where some kids, if your parents earn a certain amount, they just have to pay for lunch themselves. There's some kids who parents make enough that they don't get meals for free, but they get a reduced price lunch. And then there's kids who are so poor that they get a free lunch. That to me is an equality program, but they would call it an equity program because it's providing the kid being able to see the baseball game. I don't know.
Right.
Look, like I'll return again to Marx and sort of say, any difference between two people can be expressed as an inequality, right? So Ibram Kendi says that if there's any major racial sort of division in any sort of phenomenon, it is necessarily the result of racism, right? That if you look at a system and you see clear differences between outcomes by race, then that can only be the process of progress. It's sort of the result of racism. And many people have pointed out this would lead one to sort of look at the NBA and say, well, clearly racism is keeping white people out of the NBA, right? You could look at like the proportions of people who celebrate Kwanzaa, and I assure you that is not anywhere like racially equal. And if that is the sort of result of racism, what are we even talking about? So, like I said, after the communist revolution, if I could wave a wand, we had the communist revolution tomorrow, there's still going to be a lot of different people who have a lot of different strengths and weaknesses, and different forms of community regard are going to be attracted by those people, regardless of the economic system, right? The statement, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need, implies that the people have different abilities, right? It implies that different people are good at different things. That will never change, right? Yeah. What we want to do is to create a floor, right, of minimal material conditions that we don't want anyone to fall below. And we will provide people with the means that they need, such as food stamps, etc., in order to raise that floor. Where the floor should be put is the work of politics, right? That's what people fight about. Right. But equality is a ghost in the shell, if that's a term, a ghost in the machine. It's just very, very often not a coherent goal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I think it is fraught with a lot of misunderstanding at the least. Mm-hmm. A few more things here. I wanted to ask about quality education. You mentioned this somewhere in the book. You said that lack of quality education isn't the problem. I feel so. I'm thinking about this more at the higher levels. So at undergrad and graduate programs. Is there not enough emphasis on quality education in classrooms? And if you don't think quality education isn't the problem, then what would be? Because I think it is. I think quality education. I don't think it's the only issue, but I think it's a primary one that on a lot of different levels that people are aside from the financial pieces and all these things like that, people don't like going to school anymore, again, at higher ed, because everyone will say, I can just watch a YouTube video, or I can just read Freddie's blog and just, get all this stuff. I don't need to go to class and write papers and all these things. And I feel like that's different when you have quality education of instructors and professors and teachers that are really engaging, not just with an information dump, but synthesis, how you're able to get things out, how you're able to show your knowledge, mentorship, training, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So why do you think quality education isn't, or lack of it isn't the problem? And if it's not, what do you see is the problem with education?
So, look, I think that the best way to define this is to think that everyone individually has a potential, right?
Okay.
And that they can be artificially restricted from reaching that potential. But the ability of education to get people to exceed their potential is not proven, to put it mildly. I mean, I would remind you that we are working on 40 plus years of a national narrative of educational crisis. And the results are where we are right now, right? It's important to say the United States spends extravagantly on education.
Oh, yeah.
Okay? We spend something like 8 times more per student than Vietnam, but on many quality metrics, we are at the exact same place as Vietnam. There's no relationship between the amount of money spent by a state on education and that state's performance on various educational metrics. So Utah pays just about as Utah does just about as well as New York, but Utah is I believe pays the least per student in the entire country, and New York pays close to the most. I think only New Jersey is higher. Look, we had an experiment with COVID and with the school closures that demonstrates that it's possible to significantly reduce the amount of learning that happens by just literally keeping kids out of school, right? In other words, when kids don't go to school, then they don't learn, and that makes a big difference. Which is not something that I've ever disagreed with. Where I would disagree with is my guess is that most students who are in school, and it's a guess, but most students who are attending schools, your average public American school, is working pretty close to their personal potential, right? The trouble is that a lot of times what the policy apparatus is demanding is that we move kids significantly beyond their potential relative to other kids, and it's very, very hard to do that. Now, it's important to say the United States does very, very well in certain metrics, in certain ways of slicing up the population. So the median American student is probably doing fine. Okay. But we have, the reason our averages are so low is look, at the top end, I'll put American kids up against any country in the world. If you want to compare like the top 1%, top 3%, whatever, we regularly kick ass in like the chemistry Olympiads, the math Olympiads. We pump out chess champions, etc. Yeah. That stuff, the top of our distribution, we don't need to worry about them at all. Okay, but we're dragged down by these extremely low performing schools that tend to be found concentrated in certain geographical locations. I think that the reason for that is a complicated confluence of very many factors that are sort of being coalesced together in a way that makes it difficult to sort of pull out individual things. I mean, the thing is if you look at like the racial achievement gap, my guess is that it's the result of many, many, many small discrete factors that together aggregate up in order to pull the average down. That's a depressing thing if true, because it's much, much harder to change many, many small factors than it is to change one big factor. But look, in any individual case, you could have a class where the teacher really isn't worth her salt, or a school where the overall level of what people are getting is lower overall. But from the point of view of the system, right? Students sort themselves into a given ability band very early on in life, and then they stay in that band throughout life. So like, as a good example of of how this works. Third grade reading group. So usually like low, medium, high is how you divide the kids by reading. But that's a very strong predictor of how they'll finish in high school. Okay. So, from 8 to 18, you're effectively predicting across that thing.
Yeah.
Because the reality is that most students are just sort of sitting in their ability band and they don't change that much over time. And one thing that we know is that switching them to different schools, even if schools of perceived different quality, doesn't make a big difference either. There's dozens of studies that show that when you take a kid from one school and you send them to, this is random placement now, if you're randomly placing kids from one school or one school system into a school or school system of perceived higher quality, there's no effect to be determined. I have this all written up in if you want to search this stuff, just Google education doesn't work. And my blog should be the first thing that pops up. So yes, I mean, you can certainly quibble about your kid's teacher, your town's school board, your state's educational standards, and if they're producing as good teaching as we want. But overall, the fundamental problem is one, we have a lot of problems with kids who are in deeply concentrated poverty and who have all manner of environmental effects that are dragging them down, and they drag our averages down. But number two, if what you want is for school to get the most out of a given kid, I think you can feel pretty good about the system. If what you want is to take a career B- student and make them an A student, we just don't have data to suggest that that's possible.
I hate this fact. I can't. You lay it out very nicely, and I don't. It's hard to disagree with, I guess.
I'll tell you a story, a real world story here. Okay.
Go ahead.
So France, like a lot of European nations, has had a problem with long-term male youth unemployment. Right?
Yeah.
This has been a problem for many decades, right?
Yeah.
So in the 70s, they decided, well, part of the problem is that France used to have mandatory military service, the way that Israel still does, the way that Korea still does, etc.
Right.
So they decided, okay, we're gonna get rid of conscription. We're not going to have the draft anymore. And your military service is not going to be mandatory anymore. And so they set an arbitrary date and said anyone born before this date still has to do it. Anyone born after this date does not have to do it, which created like a natural experiment, right? And so what they thought would happen was that unleashing all these 18 and 19 and 20-year-olds from having to do their military service would get those kids to then go to college. They'd get better jobs, and then we would show up in the employment data and in the income data. That we would see unleashing, hundreds of thousands, I think, of French youth, young Frenchmen, out of their conscription. Now they can go to college. Well, when the results came back, a few years later, not only did the income level not change, not only did the unemployment level not change, the number of people graduating from college barely changed. Right? Why? Because the students were yes, the mandatory military service had been a screen. But the students also were operating with their own screen, right? Which is that they weren't people who wanted to go to school. So important to understand for this example, for the story, is that really academically inclined Frenchmen could already get out of their military careers before this happened. If they scored above a certain score or whatever, if you demonstrated enough academic ability, you could go straight to college anyway. So the people who weren't able to go to college weren't going to go to college anyway. The ones who went to college mostly dropped out, right? Because you can create the screen, or you can take a screen and you can remove the screen, right?
Yeah.
But the underlying difference in academic inclination, so the desire to go to school, which is as important as the ability, and the underlying level of ability is acting as its own screen, right? And I think that what we're doing a lot of in education policy is people are trying to pull back those screens and wondering why they're not seeing the effects. But they're not seeing the effects because underlying that is the people's level of academic inclination and academic ability.
Yeah, no, that's a great way of explaining it. So I have two more topics here real quick. They kind of bleed into each other. So, you can, again, give us the 5-minute version or however you want to do it. But so I remember 2001, No Child Left Behind. It was well loved by everybody immediately. That's a joke. Yeah, it just never. Very quickly, people were just trashing it and dogging it, and it was terrible. And I think it probably legitimately was terrible. So you can just remind us what that was and why people didn't like it, why it didn't work. And then also we have many things. I don't think it's everywhere, but a lot of places we have this Common Core curriculum, which is another problem. And so why are these things? You can explain both. Why aren't they ever successful? Gets a lot of hype, a lot of fanfare. People really like it, and then it just falls. Why has that been the case for Department of Education at that level, for the past 20 years? So,
look, to give your listeners a sense of how unpopular No Child Left Behind was,
please, yeah.
At the height of their bitter feuds, Obama and congressional Republicans came together to get rid of that bill. Okay, that's how bad it was viewed.
2010, 2011, they were like, you know what? We both agree. This is pretty garbage.
So the basic idea of No Child Left Behind was we need to set really strict standards for achievement. We need to figure out if kids are meeting that standards by enforcing a really rigorous testing schedule on them. And we need to have a no excuses policy. Now, there's a few things what was going on here. The first thing is that Bush had been the governor of Texas, and he had presided over what was called the Texas Miracle, which is that Texas test scores suddenly got a lot better. And they said it was because of this accountability philosophy and a lot of testing, a lot of assessment, a lot of standards, and consequences for teachers in schools who didn't pass. It later was revealed that entire effect was a mirage, that in fact Texas was being who was actually doing this depends on who you talk to, but Texas was sort of cooking the books in the sense of a lot of selection bias. So just students who were underperforming were just not getting counted in the testing data, which is why the results looked so good. The problem was that, the issue was never a lack of accountability. Plenty of states already had accountability systems in place before No Child Left Behind. This is not like strictly speaking true, but effectively No Child Left Behind required 100% compliance. So that literally all students had to reach certain performance benchmarks by the time they, by a certain set date. And what happened is that they just kept not meeting them, just because you can't you can stamp around and talk about accountability all you want, and you can threaten to fire teachers or whatever else. But the kids were not suddenly going to get a lot smarter. In education, you're fighting for like a quarter of a standard deviation in everything that you do, right? And it's important to say what No Child Left Behind demanded as its sort of standard of excellence that we would meet. It's not just that no country has ever achieved that in history. It's that no country has ever really attempted that in history. The only time we see sort of educational effects of that size is when you have like really sudden modernization. So people are moving from like literally no school to school. But then you hit these plateau effects.
And I think it was also the fact that it put too much pressure on teachers as well. I think that's what people got really upset about. It was way totally unrealistic.
Well, here's a very durable finding in American education. You ask people how American education is doing, and they say that it's doing poorly in polling. You ask, how well does your child's school or teacher do? And they rate them very highly. Okay. They think the country is doing bad, but leave my kid alone and leave my teacher alone. Right. Parents tend to be, in fact, quite positive about their local schools and their local teachers. There was one of the things about No Child Left Behind is that at the initial stage, there was some funds that were set aside so that states could develop these tests that they were going to implement in order to meet standard. But those were not permanent funds. Those were funds just for the initial spin up and the development of the testing instrument. And what happened is that the schools now had a sudden new large line item in their budget, the states did, for education, where now a lot of these tests were by Pearson, an educational testing company, and they might have been charging, I don't know, $35 a test. And all of a sudden, these states were looking around like, wait, we got to spend $35 extra a student every year for their test, which that might not sound like much, but at scale, it's a lot of fucking money.
Yeah, at scale, yeah, it's huge.
Right. And so part of the reason why the opt-out movement, which is parents opting their kids out of the standardized testing, part of the reason it's been so successful is that the states were looking for an excuse anyway. So it was replaced with something called the Every Student Succeeds Act, which is not particularly better. But the fact of the matter was just that, like, the Obama administration was issuing exemption after exemption after exemption because people were just not meeting standard. And somebody said, this has got to happen. Common Core is a set of principles and guidelines for what should be shared by students when they graduate from an American K through 12 school system. Look, the standards are the standards. The math curriculum is very controversial. You can read a lot of writing about why that is. It's a system of teaching math that many people don't use. Parents are often very frustrated because their students are being taught something that they didn't learn in terms of how to do math. The issue with the Common Core is that the Gates Foundation, Bill Gates, essentially passed a law in this country, meaning at one point, I think there were 44 states who were Common Core states. I think several have left because it became like a conservative cause to dump Common Core. But what happened was that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is this extremely deep-pocketed philanthropic organization run by Bill Gates and his ex-wife that has done a ton of spending in the educational space. They can push policy because people want the funding. And essentially, they came into a lot of states and they just they did a full court press on state legislatures to pass the Common Core. And these things passed with tremendously little, if that makes sense, with very little public debate. And essentially, like, this private entity, this foundation, essentially like made law and made the Common Core the law of the land in many places, which is like, that's like a thing that happens in American education, is that these foundations, like the Ford Foundation, Reed Hastings, who's the CEO of Netflix, has his own foundation. They wield a lot of power in these spaces. I mean, look, like, I'm for less. I'm for fewer standards, not more. I want more flexibility, so I'm not particularly enamored of the Common Core. In general, they are more directives for developing standards than they are specific standards themselves. But the real problem was there was just no democracy happening in terms of how they were implemented. I mean, when I was researching, I would go back and I would find a state where the Common Core passed and looked up where it passed, and I would check the major newspapers in the weeks leading up to it. There wouldn't be a single major story about this very influential set of changes. So the perception of Common Core got wrapped up in this big neoliberal, No Child Left Behind sort of takeover, which has proved to be very unpopular in recent years.
Yeah. Just real quick, you like charter schools? You don't like them? Mixed feelings? That was another trendy thing that people really loved, and I think people have some kind of falling out with it. I mean, just briefly, what do you think?
I'm not a supporter of charter schools. I mean, look, like, you can just look at how the rhetoric has changed recently, which is, for decades, Charter school proponents said that charter schools were going to produce transformative quantitative gains, that the test scores and the GPAs and everything were going to shoot through the roof in charter schools. And the reality is that it just kept not happening. Even in the studies that find the charter school effect, the effect tends to be underwhelming. I'm also someone who thinks that there are selection effects that are being hidden in how these things go. So I have a piece, one of the first pieces I wrote for my newsletter is about charter schools. The lottery systems that they utilize are kind of a black box in many places. There's not a lot of consistency. There's no consistency from state to state, but even within states, sometimes there's differences from school to school. So, look, like if you have a school that's a public charter and it genuinely does not cost any funds from another from a regular K through 12 public school, that's not the worst thing in the world. But it's just things like the Success Charter Academy, where which has an enormous attrition problem. So students. People will brag about how good their graduating students are, but so many students drop out over the course of their careers, and the students who drop out are the ones who are more likely to perform poorly anyway. Issues like that. There was this whole narrative about charter schools being the tool that was going to create these things. But again, I don't think that sort of competition between schools is what's going to prompt gains, because I don't think that the problem is the quality of the schooling. I think the problem is we have a normal distribution of academic ability among students, and the data reflects that reality. Yeah. To give you a sense of how the deck is stacked, people call the New Orleans charter system the New Orleans miracle. Half of the schools in a couple of years ago, half the charter schools in New Orleans got a D rating or an F, right? And that's what we call a miracle. So it's just a lot of hype for not a lot of outcome.
Yeah. So land us home here. You talk about tangible reforms at the end of the book. You provide a few. You talk about universal childcare, after school care, lower the legal dropout to 12, eliminate charter schools, and loosen standards. Just tell us about some of your ideas about how education could be improved on, and how we get rid of this cult of smart and have more balanced education system.
So on the educational side, I mean, I've already talked a little bit about, I think vocational tracks, I think, are something that work in a modern Western democracy like Germany and can work here. We have to fight in order to reduce stigma about that, so that people don't feel like they're on the dumb track or anything like that. And it won't always be easy, but if it's soft tracking where students and parents can choose, I'm cool with that. Yep. I'm a fan of these ideas of badging systems where, so for example, you go to college and you take a couple of classes in data analysis or whatever, and rather than just getting the degree at the end, you get like a badge or a certificate or something like, here's a discrete skill that I have. And that allows for a couple of things. I mean, for one thing, it helps to it helps employers sort of sort out from a sea of degrees who's actually specialized in a way that's useful for their position. But it also means that, the very high portion of people who attend college for a while but never graduate at least have something, right? So in other words, if you dropped out after 2 years, but you accumulated 3 badges, you could take those badges onto the job market and you can use them. Ultimately, look, like, I think that we have we should have an abundance agenda, which means that we should recognize that we're getting better at everything all the time, and that we have a tremendous ability to sort of bring resources to bear and to do amazing things. And we should not leave people behind simply because they aren't someone who's made out for school. There's lots of ways to be a good person and lots of ways to be a valuable person, but what's saleable on the job market at any particular time is not, a reflection of your character. And so I would like to build a stronger social safety net and a system that is more redistributive in order to protect people from the vagaries of the job market, so that, again, it was just a lot better to be a high school graduate in 1970 than it is in 2022, right? And that's not the fault of the individual, and we should try to put policies in place that minimize the impact of that on such a person.
Yeah, I agree. Well, the book is called The Cult of Smart: How Our Broken Education System Perpetrates Social Injustice. It's out everywhere, and it's fantastic. Where can people find you? You plug the newsletter, the Substack, and next book, and online, and all the relevant places.
Yeah, it's freddie.deBoer.substack.com. You can find it just by searching my name, which is a paid newsletter with a lot of stuff, including a lot of perks for people who subscribe. I'm also working on my second book, which it looks like is going to be titled "Whatever Happened to 2020: How Elites Ate the Social Justice Movement."
That's a good title. Yeah, that's very nice. Well, look, Freddie, this is such a wonderful conversation. I was really looking forward to it. Didn't disappoint. We talked about all the relevant stuff, many of the stuff from the book, and many other things. And so I'm really grateful that you came on and talked to me for a couple hours. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, of course.